Is it lawful for a man or woman to divorce his or her spouse for any cause whatsoever? We're going to dive into this topic and explore in the light of the Holy Scriptures what Jesus says about this question. So let's begin by going to Matthew chapter 19 from verse 1 through 9, where Jesus addresses this matter. When Jesus finished these words, he left Galilee and went to the district of Judea across the Jordan. Great crowds followed him, and he cured them there. Some Pharisees approached him and tested him, saying, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause whatever?" He said in reply, "Have you not read that from the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and said, 'For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh.' So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, no human being must separate." They said to him, "Then why did Moses command that the man give the woman a bill of divorce and dismiss her?" He said to them, "Because of the hardness of your hearts, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, unless the marriage is unlawful, and marries another, commits adultery." I just read this passage from the Revised New American Bible. So my brothers and sisters, there's a great confusion on divorce. The Catholic Church maintains that marriage is permanent, and many, perhaps most non-Catholic Christians believe in divorce. So let's try to see what Jesus is saying here. Many have misunderstood this passage, and partly because of some of the poor translations of the Bible and the lack of understanding the Bible in light of the sacred traditions. Because many people say, "Well, I'm just going to read the Bible on my own and understanding by myself." So some translations have caused confusion on this topic. So I'm going to elaborate on it and edify us, or at least those who are willing to go deeper in this topic. So Jesus said in Matthew chapter 19, verse 9, "I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, unless the marriage is unlawful, and marries another, commits adultery." Let's read this verse perhaps from a different translation, the Douay-Rheims Bible, for example. And verse 9 reads, "And I say to you, that whoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery. And he that shall marry her that is put away committeth adultery." Let's take note in this particular translation of the word "except it be for fornication." Let's be reminded that the word fornication is usually used in a premarital setting, right? As opposed to within the marriage. So perhaps this also hints at an exception that predates the union. But let us explore a little bit more. Let's go a little deeper to see if we can properly understand Jesus' position. Some other translations of the Bible say, for instance, whoever divorces his wife except for unchastity, or something equivalent to unchastity, right? Which can be confused with thinking that unchastity, such as unfaithfulness or adultery in marriage, could be a reason for divorce. See, unless the marriage is unlawful, seems to portray better, much better, the position of the church, that no divorce is allowed. But the marriage can be declared null, however, or annulled, if it was invalid from the beginning. In order to appreciate the strictness of Jesus on this topic, we need to review, firstly, the question that was asked to him in verse 3. So it says, some Pharisees approached him and tested him, saying, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause whatsoever? Let us take note of the words, for any cause whatsoever. In other words, they were asking if there is any possible exception warranting divorce. Given that Moses had allowed that, right? That the man give the woman a bill of divorce and dismiss her in verse 7 in some circumstances. And a bit later, I'll explain the circumstances. We're going to review the circumstances, specific circumstances under which Moses allowed that. Because that's another thing that's a little misunderstood. First of all, divorce was not the same as it is today. It's my understanding that it was the man who could repudiate his wife under certain circumstances, but not necessarily the other way around. But we will explore that in a moment. Jesus, in his answer, first emphasized the genesis of marriage in verses 4 to 5. What did he say in verses 4 to 5? He says, have you not heard that from the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. He's emphasizing the genesis of marriage. Then he continues in verse 6, saying, so they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, no human being must separate. Let's take note of the words, what God has joined together, no human being must separate. Jesus thus emphasizes the permanentness of the marriage bond, also known as sacrament today in the church. So when Jesus says in verse 9, whoever divorces his wife unless the marriage is unlawful and marries another commits adultery, he is in fact doubling down on his previous statement by confirming that there is no exception to divorce. In other words, he first says, whatever God has united, whatever God has joined together, no human being must separate. Then he doubles down by saying, whoever divorces, therefore whoever breaks that bond, right, by divorcing his wife, unless that marriage was unlawful, and marries another, commits adultery. So that couldn't be more clear about Jesus' position on the matter. But I want to take us a little deeper into what actually happened and was said at that moment. And for that, we're going to explore the vision of this particular passage of the gospel. In fact, Maria Valtorta, which was a servant of God, was privileged to receive a lot of visions on the life of Christ. And the vision of this particular scene of the gospel was one of them. And she was able to document the conversation verbatim. So I want us to dive into that to perhaps shed even more light on what was said and what happened then. So according to the vision, having understood what Jesus answered to their first question, which was, we want to know whether it is lawful for a man to repudiate his wife for any reason whatsoever. So the Pharisees tried to confirm after saying that, and Jesus answered them with the genesis of marriage, right? The Pharisees tries to confirm whether Jesus meant what he said by making the following statement. So according to you, it is never lawful. And Jesus reconfirmed his position by saying, neither according to me, nor according to the Most High, or anyone with a righteous soul. They were trying to make a point that there must be some exceptions, some extreme circumstance that justify repudiating one's wife. But Jesus gave no exception, none whatsoever. As I think about it, if an act so serious as marriage can lead to irreversible consequences, such as bringing souls into this world, souls who have a right to have a loving and united family life with their father and mother, it makes sense that this act is irreversible, so long as it was valid to begin with. In Matthew 19 verse 9, the part except for unchastity, in other Bible translations or versions, it says except it be for fornication, or except for sexual immorality, or even better translated, unless the marriage is unlawful. So this passage, this part is often misunderstood and misinterpreted. Some have interpreted it as though unfaithfulness and adultery in marriage gives ground to divorce. How does Jesus respond to that in the vision? He says, and I quote, "On no account can you separate from the woman who is joined to you according to the law and blessing." According to the law and blessing, that pretty much means the sacrament of matrimony, which is marriage before God and according to God's laws, right? Now continue what Jesus says here, and I quote, "Only in the case that grace touches you and you understand that woman is not a possession but a soul, and has therefore equal rights as yours to be recognized as part of man and not an object of his pleasure, and only in the case that your heart is so hard as not to be able to raise her to the dignity of wife, after enjoying her as a prostitute, only to remove the scandal of two who live together without the blessing of God on their union, you may send her away. Because in that case, yours is not union but fornication, often not honored by the birth of children, because they are suppressed against nature or sent away as a disgrace. In no other case, because if you have illegitimate children from your concubine, it is your duty to put an end to the scandal by marrying her if you are free. Translation. What is Jesus telling us here? See, the expression unless for unchastity, which is probably better translated as unless the marriage is unlawful, is not a post-marital exception, but rather a premarital exception. In other words, Jesus is saying that the only case in which a man could repudiate his wife is if he lived with her as a married couple but without the sacrament of matrimony. In other words, they lived in concubinage, and provided that they had no children, because if there are children involved, then he must put an end to the scandal by marrying her in the church. Note how Jesus does not seem to care whether they are in love with each other or any other circumstances when he advises to marry her if they have children. In such a case, the marriage becomes a sacrifice as a consequence of disorder. My brothers and sisters, feel free to also read the Catechism of the Catholic Church on the unity and indissolubility of marriage at paragraphs 1644, 1649, and 1650. Brethren, as you can see from the fullness of the truth of Jesus Christ that the Catholic Church holds, there is absolutely no reason for divorce whatsoever. Christ does not allow divorce at all. Praise be to Jesus. Let's dive into the vision pertaining to this passage of the gospel. So Jesus was in a public place about to preach, and so I'm reading from page 438 of the Gospel as Revealed to Me, volume 5. It's chapter 357, and we're beginning at 357.9. Jesus makes a gesture that he's about to speak. Let us listen to him, says a Roman coming out of a warehouse. Shall we not be listening to a lamentation? Replies his companion. Don't you believe that, Constant? He's not so boring as your usual orators. Peace to those listening to me. It is written in Ezra. In Ezra's prayer, what shall we say now, my God, after what happened? Because if we have deserted your commandments, which you ordained through your servants. So that was Jesus beginning his speech. Okay? And then he gets interrupted. Stop! You who are speaking, we will give you the subject, shouts a handful of Pharisees who elbow their way through the crowd. The escort appears almost immediately and stops at the nearest corner. The Pharisees are now before Jesus. Are you the Galilean? Are you Jesus of Nazareth? I am, responds Jesus. Praise be to the Lord that we have found you. Their ugly faces are so rancorous that they do not show much joy for the meeting. The oldest one speaks. We have been following you for several days, but you had always left when we arrived. Why are you following me? Asked Jesus. Because you are the master, and we want to be instructed by you in regards to the dark passage of the law. There are no dark passages in the law of God. Not in the law, but Superimpositions, as you say, have been made to the law and have caused obscurity. A dim light at the most, and it is enough to turn one's mind to God to dispel it. Not everybody can do that. We, for instance, are left in the dim light. You are the rabbi, so help us. What is it that you want to know? Asked Jesus. We want to know whether it is lawful for a man to repudiate his wife for any reason whatsoever. It is something that happens frequently, and every time it causes a stir, wherever it happens. People apply to us to know whether it is lawful, and we reply according to each case. And Jesus says, and you approve what happened in 90% of the cases, and the remaining 10% which you do not approve concerns the poor or your enemies. How do you know? Because that is what happens in all human beings. And I would add a third group of people, those who would be more entitled to it if divorce were lawful. That is, real pitiful cases such as incurable leprosy, life imprisonment, or unmentionable diseases. And then the Pharisees go on and says, so according to you, it is never lawful. And then Jesus to respond, neither according to me, nor according to the Most High, or anyone with a righteous soul. Have you not read that the Creator at the beginning of times created man and woman, and he created them male and female, and it was not necessary for him to do so, because he could have created a different way of procreation for the King of creation, whom he made in his image and likeness, and it would have been a good way even if it differed from every other natural way. And he said, for this reason man will leave his father and mother and will join himself to his wife, and they will become one body. So God joined them in one unity. Thus they are no longer two, but one body only. So what God united, because he saw that it was a good thing, man must not divide. Because if that should happen, it would no longer be a good thing. Then the Pharisees continue. Why then does Moses say, if a man has taken a wife, but she does not find favor with him through something disgraceful, he will give her a writ of dismissal and send her away from his house? And Jesus responds, he said so because of the hardness of your hearts, to avoid by means of his order two serious disorders. That is why he allowed you to repudiate your wives. But it was not so from the beginning. Because a woman is worth more than an animal, which according to the caprice of its master or the free circumstances of nature copulates with this or that male, a soulless body that copulates for procreation. Your wives have souls, as you do, and it is not fair that you should tread on them pitilessly. If in her condemnation it is said, you will be subject to the power of your husband, and he will lord it over you, that must take place according to justice, and not with arrogance, offending against the rights of a free soul worthy of respect. By repudiating your wives, which is not lawful, you give offense to the soul of your companion. to the twin body which joined yours, to the whole woman whom you married, demanding honestly in her. Whilst you, O perjurers, are dishonest, disabled, at times corrupt, when you go to her and you continue to be so, taking every opportunity to strike her and give a wider scope to your unappeasable lust. Prostituters of your wives, on no account can you separate from the woman who is joined to you according to the law and blessing, only in the case that grace touches you and you understand that woman is not a possession but a soul, and has therefore equal rights as yours to be recognized as part of man and not an object for his pleasure, and only in the case that your heart is so hard as not to be able to raise her to the dignity of wife, after enjoying her as a prostitute, only to remove the scandal of two who live together without the blessing of God on their union, you may send her away. Because in that case, yours is not union, but fornication, often not honored by the birth of children, because they are suppressed against nature or sent away as a disgrace. In no other case, because if you have illegitimate children from your concubine, it is your duty to put an end to the scandal by marrying her if you are free. I am not taking into consideration the case of adultery consumed to the detriment of an unaware wife. In that case, the stones of lapidation and the fire of Sheol are holy. But for him who sends away his legitimate wife because he is satiated with her to take another one, there is but one sentence: he is an adulterer. And also, he who takes the repudiated woman is an adulterer, because if man has arrogated to himself the right to separate what God has joined, the matrimonial union continues in the eyes of God, and cursed is the man who takes a second wife without being a widower, and cursed is he who, after repudiating his wife and abandoning her to the dangers of life which compel her to get married again to have her daily bread, takes her back when she becomes a widow of her second husband, because although she is a widow, she was an adulteress through your fault, and you would double her adultery. Have you understood, Pharisees, who are tempting me? They go away thoroughly humiliated without replying. And I'm going to stop there. As you have just heard, this passage that we just read clearly articulates the reasons why Moses had allowed the Pharisees to repudiate their wives. But Jesus also called them out. He calls them out for the abuses with that process, a process which was supposed to be, as I understand it, perhaps if a man finds that his wife committed adultery or something along those lines, or caused some kind of a unlawful scandal, perhaps then he could repudiate her. But in this particular case, it had become a means for perhaps men to treat women as objects for their sexual pleasure, and perhaps if they didn't want or love her anymore, they would get rid of her. But let's understand the context of the time. At that time, there are two categories of people who were sacred to God. the orphans and the widows, right? So, why the widows? Because usually the widows would get into situations where they would not be able to provide for themselves. Women were not necessarily working like nowadays, and so a woman would perhaps be dedicated in raising their children, right? So and cooking for the household and so forth. So if the man would die, it will become a huge challenge for her to be able to feed their children, you know. And this is part of the reason why when a man would repudiate his wife, he would also make her economical conditions much worse and dire, and forcing her to commit adultery by trying to marry someone else who will provide for her. So this passage that where Jesus was were calling them out in their abuses of that process clearly illustrates that, right? But we could see here how Jesus still mentions that even if they repudiated their wife in a case where the marriage was valid, it still remained a valid marriage in front of God, despite what they do, and anything beyond that as an attempt to remarry or whatnot would be adultery. So this is a pretty clear teaching. And with this level of details surrounding the passage of the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 19, verses 1 through 9, we just read the extended version of it, right? It has become super clear that divorce is not allowed by God. And there is absolutely no reason for divorce. We are called to bear our crosses patiently. And our love is called to become sacrificial love if we encounter challenges in our marriages. Praise be to Jesus.